In the spring of 1986, somewhere between the recording sessions that would birth Master of Puppets and the tragic bus accident that would claim Cliff Burton's life, Metallica's management made a phone call that would become one of rock's greatest untold stories. The call went to a small, smoke-filled apartment in Los Angeles, where Lemmy Kilmister sat surrounded by Nazi memorabilia, empty Jack Daniels bottles, and the remnants of a career that the music industry had written off as too loud, too fast, and too ugly to ever matter. What Metallica offered him that day was more than money. It was validation, respect, and a golden ticket into the biggest thrash metal band on the planet. What Lemmy said back, just 4 words spoken through a cloud of Marlboro smoke. It would not only define his entire philosophy of life, but would earn him more respect from James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich than any million-dollar contract ever could. Those 4 words would be repeated in interviews for the next 30 years, tattooed on the arms of fans, and eventually spoken at Lemmy's own funeral by the very men who had tried to recruit him. But to understand why those 4 words mattered so much, we need to go back to the beginning, to the years when Metallica were still struggling nobodies and Lemmy was already a fallen legend, to the moment when 2 worlds collided and rock and roll was forced to choose between money and integrity. If you are enjoying this story, take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into rock and roll history. I'm the outcast who refused to die. By 1986, Lemmy Kilmister had already lived enough life for 3 ordinary men. Born Ian Fraser. Kilmister, on Christmas Eve, 1945, in the industrial heartland of Stoke-on-Trent, England. He had spent his childhood fatherless, his teenage years rebellious, and his 20s as a roadie and drug dealer for none other than Jimi Hendrix himself. He had been kicked out of Hawkwind in 1975 for getting caught with amphetamines at the Canadian border, a dismissal that still burned in his chest like acid 11 years later. The band he formed in revenge, Motorhead, had become legendary among metalheads and punks alike, but commercial success had always remained just out of reach. By the mid-'80s, Motorhead was considered a relic of a bygone era, and too raw for the polished production of mainstream metal, too ugly for MTV, and too stubborn to change. Record labels had stopped calling. Radio stations had stopped playing their songs. The music press had written countless obituaries for a band that refused to acknowledge its own death. But here is what the industry executives and music critics never understood about Lemmy Kilmister. He did not measure success by record sales or chart positions or the size of the venue he played. He measured success by whether he could look at himself in the mirror the next morning and still recognize the man staring back at him. Every compromise, every concession to commercial pressure, every time a musician bent their art to fit someone else's vision, that was a small death of the soul. And Lemmy had watched too many of his contemporaries die those small deaths to ever let it happen to him. He had seen bands he once respected turn into parodies of themselves, chasing trends, softening their sound, trading leather jackets for spandex and integrity for airplay. He swore he would never become one of them. The rise of the 4 Horsemen. Meanwhile, on the other side of the musical universe, a different story was unfolding. Metallica had formed in Los Angeles in 1981, birthed from the ashes of a classified ad and the restless ambition of a Danish immigrant named Lars Ulrich. By 1986, they had transformed from garage band nobodies into the vanguard of a musical revolution. Their album Ride the Lightning had announced them as serious contenders, and Master of Puppets was about to establish them as the undisputed kings of thrash metal. They were young, they were hungry, and they were on the verge of becoming the biggest heavy metal band in the world. But what most people did not know about Metallica in those early days was how deeply they worshipped at the altar of Motorhead. James Hetfield had discovered Motorhead as a teenager in Downey, California, and the first time he heard Ace of Spades, it rewired something fundamental in his brain. Here was music that did not apologize for itself, that did not try to be pretty, or palatable, or safe. Here was pure aggression channeled into 3-minute bursts of sonic warfare. Lars Ulrich, for all his European sophistication, was equally obsessed. He would later say in interviews that, without Motorhead, there would be no Metallica. No thrash metal movement, no modern heavy metal as we know it. Lemmy was not just an influence to them, he was a god walking among mortals. The phone call that changed everything. The exact circumstances of the offer remain disputed to this day, clouded by decades of conflicting interviews and the natural tendency of rock mythology to embellish itself with each retelling. What is certain is that by early 1986, Metallica's management had become concerned about the stability of their bass position. Cliff Burton, the virtuoso who had revolutionized the role of bass in heavy metal, was brilliant but unpredictable. There were whispers about backup plans, about potential replacements, about musicians who could step in if circumstances required. And at the top of everyone's list was Ian Fraser Kilmister, better known to the world as Lemmy. The logic was impeccable on paper. Lemmy was one of the greatest bassists in rock history, a man who played his instrument like a weapon and sang like a demon choking on gravel and whiskey. He had credibility that money could not buy, respect that could not be manufactured by any public relations firm. If Motorhead was fading into irrelevance anyway, why not bring its leader into the biggest band in metal and give him the commercial success he had always deserved? The offer that was eventually communicated to Lemmy was staggering by 1986 standards. $1 million guaranteed, plus a percentage of album sales and touring revenue. For a man who had spent the last decade living on Jack Daniels, speed, and the charity of loyal fans, it must have seemed like a lifeline thrown from heaven. And the apartment on Sunset Boulevard. To understand what happened next, you need to picture the scene in that cramped Los Angeles apartment where Lemmy received the news. The walls were covered with World War II memorabilia, iron crosses, and Nazi daggers displayed alongside Confederate flags and vintage military photographs. Not because Lemmy harbored any sympathy for fascism, as he would spend his entire life explaining to journalists who never quite believed him, but because he was fascinated by the aesthetics of evil, by the dark glamour of history's villains. On the coffee table sat the remnants of his liquid diet, empty bottles of Jack Daniels and overflowing ashtrays, and the scattered debris of a life lived without the slightest concern for tomorrow. In the corner, leaning against a battered Marshall amplifier, it was his trademark Rickenbacker bass, the same instrument that had produced some of the filthiest, most beautiful noise ever committed to tape. Lemmy listened to the offer in silence, his expression unreadable beneath that famous face, the moles, the mutton chops, the permanent squint of a man who had spent too many years staring into spotlights and cigarette smoke. He did not ask for time to think about it. He did not request a meeting to discuss terms. He did not even ask whether the offer was serious or some kind of elaborate joke. He simply removed the Marlboro from his lips, took a long pull from his glass of Jack and Coke, and delivered the 4 words that would echo through rock and roll history. The 4 words. What exactly did Lemmy say that day? The answer has been reported in various forms over the decades, but the most consistent version, confirmed in multiple interviews by both Lemmy himself and members of the Metallica camp, was devastatingly simple. Looking directly at the person delivering the offer, Lemmy said, "I already have a band. 4 words. 13 letters. a complete sentence that contained an entire philosophy of existence. He did not say no, thank you, or let me think about it, or what are the exact terms. He said, I already have a band, as if the question itself was absurd, as if the very concept of leaving Motorhead was as unthinkable as cutting off his own arm. In that moment, Lemmy was not rejecting $1 million. He was rejecting the fundamental premise that money or fame or success mattered more than loyalty, more than identity, more than the thing he had built with his own hands from the wreckage of his dismissal from Hawkwind. The aftermath and the respect. The story of that rejection spread through the music industry like wildfire, gaining mythological status with each retelling. For James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich, Lemmy's refusal only deepened their admiration. Here was a man who practiced what he preached, who actually lived by the code that most rock stars only pretended to follow. In the decades that followed, Metallica would become the biggest heavy metal band in history, selling over 125 million albums worldwide and headlining stadiums on every continent. And through all of that success, they never forgot the man who turned them down. And the relationship between Lemmy and Metallica evolved into one of the most genuine friendships in rock and roll. They collaborated on tracks together, with Motorhead covering Enter Sandman and Metallica paying tribute to Motorhead at every opportunity. Whenever the two bands crossed paths on tour, Lemmy would be found backstage with James and Lars, sharing bottles of Jack Daniels and telling war stories from the trenches of rock and roll history. There was no bitterness about the rejected offer, no awkwardness or resentment. If anything, the rejection had cemented a bond of mutual respect that commercial partnership could never have created. The tragedy that almost changed history. Just months after Lemmy rejected the Metallica offer, tragedy struck. On September 27, 1986, with the band's tour bus skidded off an icy road in Sweden, and Cliff Burton was thrown through the window and crushed when the bus rolled over him. He was 24 years old. The world of heavy metal was devastated, and suddenly the question of who would replace him became terrifyingly real. In the chaos of grief that followed, Lemmy's name came up again. But by this point, everyone knew better than to ask. Metallica eventually recruited Jason Newsted from Flotsam and Jetsam, a skilled bassist who would spend the next 14 years in the shadow of his predecessor. But some insiders have speculated about the alternate history that might have been. What if Lemmy had said yes? What if Motorhead had folded and its leader had joined Metallica? Would the Black Album have sounded different with Lemmy's growling vocals on backing tracks? Would the band have achieved even greater success? Or would Lemmy's uncompromising nature have created friction that tore them apart? These questions remain forever unanswerable, tantalizing glimpses of a rock and roll timeline that never came to pass. The philosophy behind the words. To truly understand why Lemmy said what he said, you need to understand how fundamentally different his values were from those of the mainstream music industry. For most musicians, the goal is simple: achieve success, make money, become famous, retire comfortably. The music itself is often secondary to these objectives, a vehicle for reaching other destinations rather than a destination in itself. But for Lemmy, the music was everything. Motorhead was not just a band he happened to be in, it was an extension of his soul, and as integral to his identity as his heartbeat or his fingerprints. Leaving Motorhead would have been a form of suicide, a killing of the self that no amount of money could justify. This was not naive idealism or romantic posturing. Lemmy had seen what happened to musicians who sold out, who chased commercial success at the expense of their artistic integrity. He had watched friends and contemporaries transform into hollow shells of their former selves, performing songs they hated for audiences they despised, all for the privilege of maintaining lifestyles they had never really wanted. He knew that the music industry was designed to consume artists, to extract their creative essence and discard the empty husks when the profit margins declined. And he had made a conscious decision. So somewhere in those long years between Hawkwind and rock and roll immortality, that he would rather die broke and forgotten than live rich and compromised. The long road to legend. The decades that followed Lemmy's rejection of Metallica were not easy ones. Motorhead continued to grind through the 80s and 90s, releasing album after album to diminishing commercial returns and aging audiences. There were health scares and lineup changes and moments when it seemed like the whole enterprise might finally collapse under the weight of its own stubbornness. Lemmy's lifestyle, the Jack Daniels and the speed and the cigarettes, and the complete disregard for anything resembling medical advice, should have killed him a dozen times over. Doctors would later discover that his blood chemistry had become so adapted to constant toxicity that giving him clean blood might actually have been fatal. His body had quite literally evolved to survive on poison. But something strange happened as the years went by. The world began to catch up with Lemmy. A new generation of musicians discovered Motorhead and recognized them as the godfathers of everything heavy and fast and uncompromising. Bands like Metallica and Slayer and Anthrax openly worshipped at the altar of Motorhead, introducing their massive audiences to the music that had inspired them. Lemmy, who had never changed a single note to chase commercial acceptance, found commercial acceptance coming to him anyway. By the 2000s, he was no longer a has-been or a cult curiosity. He was a living legend, on the last surviving monument to an era when rock and roll still meant something dangerous and real. The final years. By 2015, Lemmy was 70 years old and finally beginning to slow down. The years of abuse had caught up with him, manifesting in diabetes and heart problems and a general physical decline that even his superhuman constitution could not overcome. He had been forced to quit drinking, a concession to mortality that seemed to wound him more deeply than any illness. Motorhead's live shows, once legendary for their volume and aggression, became increasingly difficult as Lemmy struggled to maintain the energy that had defined him for half a century. There were cancelled tours and truncated sets and whispered concerns among fans and industry insiders that the end was approaching. But even in those final months, Lemmy refused to compromise. When journalists asked if he regretted any of the choices that had led him to this point, he would simply shrug and reach for whatever drink the doctors had allowed him that day. When they asked about the Metallica offer, about whether turning down $1 million had been the right decision, he would repeat those same 4 words with exactly the same conviction he had shown 30 years earlier. I already have a band. Nothing had changed. Nothing would ever change. The final goodbye. Lemmy Kilmister died on December 28, 2015, just 4 days after his 70th birthday. The cause was listed as cardiac arrhythmia, prostate cancer, and congestive heart failure. But everyone who knew him understood that Lemmy had not been killed by any disease, and he had simply been worn down by 70 years of living at maximum intensity, burning through his allotted fuel supply without ever once considering the possibility of conservation. He died in his apartment near the Rainbow Bar and Grill on Sunset Boulevard, the same strip of Los Angeles concrete where he had spent countless nights drinking and playing video games and holding court for generations of worshipful young musicians. The funeral, held at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in January 2016, was a gathering of rock and roll royalty, the likes of which had rarely been seen. Dave Grohl was there, and Slash, and members of every band that had ever been touched by Lemmy's influence. But the moment that everyone remembers, the moment that brought the entire congregation to tears, he was when James Hetfield took the podium to deliver his eulogy. The man who had offered Lemmy $1 million 30 years earlier stood before the assembled mourners and talked about what that rejection had meant to him. He talked about how Lemmy had taught him that integrity was worth more than any contract, that being true to yourself was the only success that really mattered. And then, his voice breaking with emotion, James Hetfield looked at Lemmy's coffin and repeated those 4 famous words one final time. "You already had a band," he said, "and it was the greatest band in the world, the legacy that cannot be bought." The story of Lemmy's rejection of Metallica has become one of rock's most enduring legends, a parable about artistic integrity in an industry that constantly demands compromise. And it has been told and retold in documentaries and biographies and late-night conversations between musicians who are trying to figure out what kind of artists they want to be. Some people hear the story and think Lemmy was a fool, that he threw away financial security and mainstream success for the sake of stubborn pride. But others, the ones who truly understand what rock and roll is supposed to mean, hear the story and recognize it for what it really is. It is a story about a man who knew exactly who he was and refused to become anything else, even when the world offered him everything he had ever been denied. James Hetfield eventually got that 4-word response tattooed on his arm, a permanent reminder of the lesson Lemmy had taught him. Lars Ulrich tells the story in interviews to this day, his voice still filled with wonder at the sheer audacity of a man who could turn down $1 million without a moment's hesitation. And somewhere in the great beyond, if there is any justice in the universe, Lemmy Kilmister is probably sitting at a bar with a Jack Daniels in one hand and a Marlboro in the other, laughing at all the fuss. Because for him, it was never really a difficult decision. He already had a band, and that was all that ever mattered. The next time you find yourself faced with a choice between money and integrity, between security and authenticity, between becoming what the world wants you to be and remaining who you actually are, remember those 4 words. Remember the man who spoke them. And remember that some things in this life are worth more than $1 million.